Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, this video is kind of different because it's technically speaking out of order. The usual way I usually do these videos is I'll just sit in front of a camera like I tend to do, yammer on for about half an hour. Most people, check out after the first 2 or 3 minutes, and then I post the video online. There's not a lot of editing, but that's just because I am not trying to do much more in these videos than simply just try to communicate some of my ideas about comics that I don't get to do in, casual day-to-day conversation. Today's video is a little different because it's me doing something that I usually don't do, which is trying to be topical. And the fact that hopefully all of my friends here have demonstrated, the time of the posting of this video, it will either be Halloween itself or possibly 1 or 2 days before Halloween. So, why is that significant, or what does it have to do with today's video? Well, today's video is also timely in the fact that it's going to deal regularly with spookiness. Or, put it another way, we're going to be doing arguably one of my favorite graphic novels, if not one of my favorite books, period, which is Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth by Grant Morrison and Dave McKean. Now, I really cannot overstate how important this graphic novel was for the medium of comics. It made a splash when it was premiered, and it was also one of, I'm definitely not the first time, because it was during the mid-1980s when a lot more people really began to sort of wake up to the notion of, oh, what if we make graphic novels sort of like a standalone event? The Killing Joke is probably one of the first real instances of that. But Batman Arkham Asylum was unique in the fact that it was a new work by a relatively new writer at that time, at least relatively new for a mainstream publisher like DC, and definitely giving a relatively unknown writer a major character like Batman and telling a story that is, well, not really a Batman story. Like, when we did this book for the graphic novel book club at Ground Zero, one of the heaviest criticisms from just about everybody else in the group was it doesn't feel like a Batman group, which may be why I kind of personally like it. But anyway, whatever the case, what's important about this book is it premiered in the year 1989, the same year that Tim Burton's Batman movie came out, a film which also created a huge splash and then also sort of began to generate a lot of buzz for comics in the 90s, thus helping to establish the eventual 1990s bust. My dog's barking at the neighbors again. Anyway, when it comes to Arkham Asylum, though, it's really important to note that this book, when it was published, created a not necessarily a spectacle, that may be giving it too much, but it created a stir because nobody had really seen a book this weird before coming from DC. And so this book effectively set the groundwork for Grant Morrison's long-term career with the character of Batman and influencing the Batman comics. And then it also set a lot of ground for some new and more edgy material to sort of settle into the 1990s. Because if you look at the comics of the 1990s, there was a more of an inclination to let's touch a little bit more on darkness. And when we're talking about darkness, we're talking oftentimes about the grotesque. This book in particular deals with insanity. It deals with madness. And so there's going to be some themes and topics that are going to be kind of heavy in this book. So, forewarning, if you have any issues whatsoever with mental health and you might get a tad triggered by some of the contents of this book, I might recommend skipping this video. Also, forewarning, when I say I have a real history with this book, that's not an understatement at all. I've read this book just about once a year, every year, since about the year 2010, so we're coming up on a decade of reading this book. I've also literally published a paper on this book. My friend Michael Greenhale of the Comics Classroom over at Comicsosity, a great website, by the way, check them out, let me effectively submit an article for his ongoing series, The Comics Classroom, which I'll post a link to in the description below. And then just in terms of my personal experience and interaction with graphic novels, this was one of the first books I read in college that sort of slowly got me back into the medium of comics again. And it was in no small part due to Grant Morrison and just his sheer Grant Morrison-ness. That's the only word I can come up for it, because I don't know any other words to describe the crazy batshit crazy man that Grant Morrison is, and a genius at the same time. And then also Dave McKean's artwork being simply sublime, and something that we'll definitely discuss more at a later date, because you can't top comics or art period without Dave McKean. But I've talked a fair amount about a little bit about the legacy of this book, what it means to me personally. I should probably now get a little bit more into the content of this book. So again, forewarning, this book is going to explore some heavy topics, including murder, rape, insanity, and so if you are the kind of person who may be triggered by some of those elements, just forewarning, we're going to have to touch on them, and some of these pages are going to get a tad graphic. So, be forewarned, let's dig into it. Okay, just a reminder, it says right here on the back, suggested for mature readers. That's because this book is, how you say, not difficult, because difficult, at least in my opinion, would suggest something a little pejorative in tone. I don't think it's that. What I would suggest instead is that this book is willing to really touch on that thin boundary that defines sanity and insanity. And when we talk about mental health, I'm also have to acknowledge my bias going into this as well. I'm someone who suffers from clinical depression. I am on medication due to suicidal thoughts and tendencies. It's something that I've struggled with for years, and being in an emotionally abusive relationship for as long as I was, that didn't help. And then also, I also want to make sure, too, as we go into the content of this book, the majority of the story takes place in an insane asylum. Having spent time in an inpatient psychiatric facility, I know firsthand what a heavy topic this is. Now, fortunately, I was nowhere near anything close to an asylum system, but I was interred in a block that was literally right next to registered psychotics. And so in this way, I do feel hopefully some ethos here in exploring these themes, but then also hopefully I just want to convey my empathy to anybody who suffers from this. This book explores sanity, what it is, and what ultimately is the foundation of our reality. And especially if you're somebody who suffers from depression, there's going to be some themes in this book that are going to hit a little heavy. But one of the most important and I think misunderstood aspects of this book is Grant Morrison is employing insanity in this book, not really so much for an exploitative method, but rather to explore basically the sum locus that is Grant Morrison. Now, when I covered this book, We Three, by Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely, we talked a little bit about some of the interesting aspects of Grant Morrison as a writer, as an author, and one of the things that sort of sort of just ever present in his work is his ability to sort of explore empathy. Whether it was watching 1, 2, and 3 escape from the military leaders who had been torturing them and experimenting them for years, Grant Morrison is really interested in symbols and ideology. And so if you open the book up, the very first thing the reader sees, apart from, God, just Dave McKean's brilliant and incredible artwork, one of the first real passages of the book is this image here, alongside a quote from Alice in Wonderland. It's the famous quote, "I don't want to go among mad people." Well, I mean, you must have, otherwise you wouldn't have come here. That's not the direct quote, but it more or less is. But what's important to the reader moving forward is we see this sort of pseudo-gateway. One of the interesting things about this book is the steadily reliance of the Egyptian tarot. Now, if you know absolutely nothing about tarot card decks, don't worry, you're not alone. I am not a terribly superstitious person. I think a lot of stuff about astrology and magic, what have you, is utter hokum. In my opinion, it's usually just psychological in nature. Nevertheless, we have to acknowledge that, especially with something like the tarot, it carries a long-lasting cultural tradition. And so the images and symbols, regardless of whether or not they have any actual power into themselves, can create real, cultural suggestions within the minds of people. And particularly with the tarot card deck, people believe it has power, and so there's an entire mythos around that. But getting back to that image of the two beams, it mimics this image right here. This card is the moon. Now, if you don't know anything about the Egyptian tarot, the most important thing is it was largely crafted and established by a man by the name of Aleister Crowley, who's largely responsible for a lot of the kind of sort of mythos arcane culture which exists. He didn't invent it, but he was one of the first people in the 20th century to really come forward and be like, no, we can use this to sort of create power within ourselves. And Grant Morrison is a heavy Aleister Crowley fan and relies on that theme and imagery throughout the book. For ultimately, at the very end, the last closing pages, sure enough, we see the image of the moon card. Again, we see it here on the very bottom once the story has come to its close, and then we see it mimic again once more with an Alice in Wonderland quote and the image of the tarot card itself. Now, what is the importance of the moon card itself? Again, I'm not a tarot expert, but as Grant Morrison explains in this, the 15th anniversary edition, which is annotated and absolutely gorgeous, he begins his book with the notion that we are entering a new domain or a new territory. And this is important. The content of Arkham Asylum is that the inmates of Arkham Asylum have effectively taken over the insane asylum, taken many of the crew and psychologists hostage, and they want Batman to come in. Batman is scared. Saying that out loud should probably give you an idea of, wait, what? Batman? Scared? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But nevertheless, it's true. Batman is extraordinarily terrified about going in. And what we observe in this gorgeous, wonderful book is a sort of steady deterioration of Batman's psychology. He's not the sort of always confident Dark Knight. He's a man who's continually doubting himself. And ultimately what takes place is Batman passes through the gateways into the asylum into a realm populated by madmen, but more importantly, a realm that is going to challenge his understanding of himself and his confidence. So effectively what happens then is he encounters just about every single one of the inmates in Arkham Asylum. So he encounters Scarecrow, he encounters the Mad Hatter, Killer Croc, Dr. Destiny, Black Mask, and of course, who could possibly forget the Joker. Presented here and this kind of sort of absolute grotesque vision, though not as grotesque as the original idea. He was originally going to be in a kind of like frilly lingerie gown and high heels with like Madonna cone breasts. I'm not making this up, seriously. Look it up, get the 15th anniversary edition. There's sketches that Grant Morrison did. He wanted this and they like, no. Anyway, at the same time Batman is going through the asylum, encountering these villains one by one, and sort of steadily being challenged in terms of his perception of himself and his sanity, the story also tells the narrative of a man by the name of Amadeus Arkham. Now, longtime Batman fans are going to find something immediately there. They know Amadeus Arkham. He's the founder of Arkham Asylum, the madhouse in Gotham City. But what's unique about the story is that you are effectively told the story of Amadeus Arkham through his personal diary. And the story follows Amadeus Arkham from his childhood, when he is effectively watching his mother slowly losing his mind, to he and his family trying to sort of move into the new asylum to establish a life for themselves, and then eventually Amadeus Arkham stumbling upon his wife and daughter having been brutally murdered by a man by the name of Mad Dog Hawkins. And then eventually we observe that Amadeus Arkham not only went mad and began killing off several of the asylum inmates, but he ultimately killed his mother and went insane himself. So what we see in this particular graphic novel are two men who begin their journey into the realm of madness and insanity, assured, relatively confident, but with a troublesome past. In the case of Amadeus Arkham, he is continually plagued by the insanity that slowly deteriorated his mother's mental health, and then ultimately left him with a profound sense of isolation and distraction. And in the case of Batman, we have a character who, though he has established a kind of alter ego to protect his mind, is now entering into a domain and a territory where he is basically not out of his depth per se, but in a realm where he is far more vulnerable than he had been in the past. So, is that the entire story? In broad terms, yes, and I recognize at 8 minutes I probably should stop there, but it's important to recognize that this book is not solely just Batman goes into the asylum, sees a bunch of crazy people, and then eventually gets out. Nor is it simply Amadeus Arkham encounters a bunch of heavy shit and slowly goes insane. It's really hard to explain in just simple terms what this book actually is, because as much as it is just the story of Batman coming into the asylum and encountering all these characters and coming out stronger for the experience with a sort of reaffirmed notion of self, it's also very much an exploration of symbols and how ultimately these images have a sort of kind of story in and of themselves and a lasting impact. The story of Arkham Asylum, A Serious House and Serious Earth, is ultimately a journey of the self through this foreign territory. Because, as you can observe through some of the depictions as well, Batman is often portrayed not necessarily as the big, buff, bulky Batfleck type character that we might see in a Frank Miller graphic novel. Rather, Dave McKean often has him as a kind of shadow. And I know that's a visual element, that's where I'm supposed to be getting into the form of the book, but that in itself is important in terms of the content. Because when we're talking about the story, though the character is Batman on some level, he also becomes effectively a shadow for the audience as well. So when we observe this book, we have effectively 3 stories being told. We have the story of Batman, who is going into the asylum and ultimately conquering over the villains who are trying to break his mind. We also have the story of Amadeus Arkham, who attempts to conquer insanity and then is ultimately undone by it. And then finally, we have us, the reader, who is encountering villain after villain, horror after horror, and then attempting to determine for ourselves what is that line between sanity and insanity. And that's all I'm going to say, because if I continue talking about what is the content of this book, we're going to be here all day, and I haven't even gotten into the form, which, trust me, we're going to talk about that for a bit. But hopefully you can see, this is a really interesting story. It's not the traditional Batman book, but that's honestly why I like it. Rather than just having a firmly established Batman, it allows the reader to kind of call into question, well, if this is a place is enough to break down the archetype of Batman, what does it say about my own sanity? And what is it ultimately that makes me insane and makes me, well, myself? Well, as Batman says here so beautifully, stronger than them, stronger than this place. I have to show them. That's insane. Exactly. Arkham was right. Sometimes it's only madness that makes us what we are. Or destiny, perhaps. And what's important here is at the very end, we observe Batman appears more human than he possibly has throughout the rest of the text. And so hopefully what I'm getting to you by the end of this book is much like going through into a new territory and into a new realm. What we observe in this story is a hero and an archetype going in unsure and then effectively rebuilding himself up. And so in terms of the content of the story, it's as much a story of Batman conquering his own insecurities, Amadeus Arkham falling prey to his madness, and then hopefully also the reader determining for themselves what is it that determines their sanity and why is it so important. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Now, we've talked about the content, let's talk about why formally this book is just gorgeous. Okay, so we've passed the first hurdle. Let's go to the second one. Now, again, when we talk about this book, we've discussed why content-wise I think is really amazing. And honestly, that was a short and condensed version of why I think this book is amazing. I can talk literally hours about why I think this book is great, because every page is a work of art in terms of its construction. But in terms of the use of the employment of art, that becomes important as well, because I noted at the very beginning it's a Grant Morrison book, but it's also illustrated by Dave McKean. Now, if you've heard that name, it's because you might have heard of a series... Oh, sorry, Cthulhu. Well, there's the Books of Magic, but then there's also Sandman by a little man by the name of Neil Gaiman. He sounds familiar. Anyway, Dave McKean, though he did not do all of the artwork for the Sandman series, did all of the covers for the Sandman series and is a long-term collaborator with Neil Gaiman. And when I say that Dave McKean is an artist in the purest sense of the term, I mean that. I don't have to show you just all the examples of Dave McKean's artwork that I have in my library, though I would be more than happy to show you. One need only open up this book and see firsthand just the tremendous power he is able to exhibit in terms of his mastery of comics. So if we look at this page alone, this is the room in which Batman and Joker have entered into the actual asylum itself. It says down here on the bottom, the text is a tad difficult to read, but let the feast of fools begin. And then, of course, we get all these little word balloons by various inmates, and we have this sort of bizarre collage over here to the side. And though the reader is sort of left to sort of wander all over the place and try to figure out what exactly is happening here, this full-page spread should hopefully demonstrate to the reader how Dave McKean is taking a lot of the elements of insanity and symbol together to create a visual effect upon the reader. Likewise, again, if we look at Batman arriving outside of the asylum, we have this gorgeous depiction of Joker. Again, throughout the main body of the text, Dave McKean often presents the Joker as this sort of smudgy character who's often sort of porous or devoid of much physical contact, but then at the same time, he has a realness that is just profoundly unsettling to the reader. This page alone, this panel alone, in which he screams out, "April Fools!" I literally had to put the book down for 5 minutes the first time I ever read it, because I was just so profoundly unsettled by it. But one of the interesting things about Dave McKean, hopefully by these pages alone, is that he does not simply do, the panel by itself and allow ink to be the sum total of his effort. I don't know why it was so difficult saying that. When you're talking about a Dave McKean artwork, what's important is you are ultimately talking about multimedia. Dave McKean has been known to use just smorgasbords of random hocus pocus in order to make some of the panels in the books that he's worked on. And so if you look at, say, Mr. Punch by Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean, you can observe in just these 2 pages alone a mix of photographs, puppets, and then sort of actual ink and sketch work. Dave McKean has a wide variety of tools and tricks at his disposal. And so when we open up the first few pages of Arkham Asylum, we observe several pages to get us in the tone of the book itself. Looking at this work here, this is ultimately a photograph mixed in with the actual lettering done by McKean. Or, excuse me. Somebody else did the lettering. My apologies. I'll find that out and put it in the description note below. But what I'm just trying to offer to the viewer is that if simply looking at it, you can see the range of material that McKean works with to create the visual tone. Using this photograph of a bat skeleton in order to bring you into the notion of bat. And then on this page as well, which is largely the title page, we also see a note of the Passion Play with an architectural deconstruction of a cathedral and then the image of nails. Passion plays, for the record, were often recreations of the crucifixion in medieval times. It was a sort of a propagandistic effort by the Catholic Church in order to sort of sway people into, well, just remembering that Jesus loves you. But on top of all of these elements, what's really gorgeous about this book is the way that McKean balances Morrison's Morrison's narrations to create an effect upon the viewer. If you look at this 2-panel page spread here, Amadeus Arkham is talking about walking through the asylum, and then at one point he discusses taping the mirror in his office shut. Which, if you then look at this page, you'll observe how the panels steadily become skinnier and skinnier and skinnier before it then pans back to show Amadeus Arkham seemingly swallowed up by this steadily growing serpent figure. So, at the same time he's taking walks through the asylum, we observe that his figure is dwarfed within these sort of long horizontal panels. There appears to be an eye watching him as he's contemplating to the reader out loud. And then at the same time, he goes to the trouble to make his panels smaller and smaller, thus mimicking the idea that as Amadeus is standing in front of the mirror, we are the people in the mirror watching him slowly disintegrate into nothing. Now, I've also brought up the fact that the tarot is extraordinarily important. The reason for that is, in the book, the character of Two-Face is being psychologically evaluated by one of the doctors, and they're introducing him to the notion of choice. Taking away his quarter, his scarred coin, to just, rely on a binary, they introduce him to a dice, and then eventually they introduce him to the tarot card deck as a way of giving him more choices and building himself back up. Now, we observe, ultimately, there's a heavy criticism of it because in the moment he's introduced, he basically soils himself on the floor. Nevertheless, at this moment, McKean, like Morrisson, is allowing the visuals of the Egyptian tarot card deck to come in and hold significance. That card, for the record, is the Tower. And hopefully you can see it just by looking at it. It's not even a subtle recreation. In all likelihood, this is just Dave McKean taking a photograph of it and employing that into the actual panels themselves. So again, we have here a really profoundly interesting exploration of what is possible through the medium, because you don't just have to draw the characters interacting with other. Allowing a figure like Dave McKean as the artist provides another dimension. The reader begins to feel over time that they are in this new world that is largely composed of insanity and mythos and symbol. And you begin to sort of wonder yourself, what is actually happening? What is actually real, and am I losing my mind? And one particular instance, and arguably in my opinion, one of the most sort of deflating or underutilized elements of the book, Scarecrow appears to Batman, sort of scraping this pitchfork across the ground. He has sort of like this moment where he looks at Batman, and then he disappears. He leads Batman to this one-chamber room where we get Mad Hatter. And as Grant Morrison says himself, it's a lovely little passage in the fact that Mad Hatter more or less just explains the entire concept of the book. We observe in one particular panel, he says, sometimes I think the asylum is a head. We're inside a huge head that dreams us all into being. Perhaps it's your head, Batman. Arkham is a looking glass, and we are you. This passage is really gorgeous and visually stunning, not simply for the way that Dave McKean draws these figures, the way he arranges them on the page, the way he sort of superimposes this anatomical illustration on top of Mad Hatter, who's having this moment, and then ultimately down there at the very bottom, when the Hatter begins to fade away and all we're left is Batman. But as I pointed out before, you're not even really getting Batman. You're continually getting this shadow of Batman. So hopefully you can see, just from some of these examples alone, there is so much exploration and play taking place in this book. And McKean and Morrison both feel or are able to convey through the images, through the story, a real sense of power, insanity. You're wondering or sort of continually questioning what is ultimately real, and is this all being imagined, but without having to worry about was it all a dream? Because, God, don't you just hate that? It's obnoxious. Now, I've talked a lot about Dave McKean's role in terms of making this book what it is, and he deserves all the credit in terms of the visual structure of the book. But it's also important to remember that the book was written by Grant Morrison, who, at the time this book was being written, was making a real name for himself by working on this comic book here, Doom Patrol. Doom Patrol had existed for years. There was actually an old Doom Patrol that had existed during the 1960s. The original comics were kind of campy, but they were also kind of weird and trippy. It was mostly an opportunity to make some comics that would appeal to stoners and, LSD takers. But at the same time, because Grant Morrison had been more or less raised by a group of hippies and LSD takers and pot smokers, you had the perfect man writing the perfect comic. And much the way that Arkham Asylum is an exploration of theme and mythos and story, Doom Patrol is nothing if not experimental philosophy and Dadaism and obscure genre references. And so you see at this moment an author who's already playing with a lot of these ideas and incorporating them into a Batman book. So he's understanding how important symbol is to a figure like Batman. Grant Morrison isn't just sort of throwing all these symbols into play simply because he thinks, hey, these would look good on the page. No, he's throwing these images out to the reader because he wants them to sort of understand and reevaluate them in this new context. So in this particular instance, Arkham Asylum has taken hallucinatory mushrooms, and we observe him sort of slowly beginning to undergo the trip. And at first, we have simply the duality, the Pisces right here. Or no, wait, does he say the Pisces? Yes. Pisces, the astrological attribution of the moon card in the tarot pack, the symbol of trial and initiation, death and rebirth. And literally, the next page is Batman facing off against Killer Croc. This is arguably the most bloody and brutal confrontation in this book, not to mention one of the most, like, actually physical confrontations. But what's important here is that Amadeus Arkham's acid trip, or excuse me, mushroom trip, effectively spirals out into the real break of his mind. But what's important here is that while Grant Morrison is narrating Amadeus Arkham's downfall, Dave McKean is using Batman's, at first, downfall, but then rebirth through the figure of Saint Michael into a kind of spiritual reevaluation and reaffirmation of self. This book is loaded with symbol and action that is really heavy in meaning. And so hopefully I've been able to convey that, formally speaking, what's important about this book is not simply just the fact that Dave McKean uses a lot of interesting photographs and, like, sort of cut out takes from, like, old stock photos and just gorgeous after gorgeous paintings and illustrations. There's a lot of concern for the arrangement of the panels on the page and making sure that the symbols and ideas contained in the script manifest in a really profound visual fashion on the page. And probably one of the most beautiful images of the last 2 pages of the book are when Two-Face has gotten his coin back. He looks to the tarot card deck, or really in this instance looks to the reader, says, "You're nothing but a deck of cards, who cares for you?" and effectively smashes them out of his way. We're left at the very closing pages once more with the image of the moon card, the idea of birth and death. Harvey, we have seen, has undergone a kind of death and rebirth. He had first lost himself, and then he has found himself again. And by visually striking the cards out of the way, he's managed to sort of reaffirm his sense of self. And what's interesting, again, at the same time, is the way these panels are arranged and the way he looks at the reader, through the reader. You're able to convey, or he's able to convey to you, the reader, that you're nothing but a deck of cards. You're not even real. Who cares for you? Knocking you, the reader, right out of the way to return to the life that makes sense to him. I love this book so much. I love this book immensely. And hopefully now I've conveyed just how dense this book is in terms of its construction. I haven't even gotten into all the small, tiny details that I would like to. I've almost considered doing a whole small video series just about this one book. And now I might do it. Who knows? Stay tuned. Anyway, the importance of a book like Arkham Asylum is not simply the story itself, but the way the visual language is continually and expertly executed in this book. Dave McKean creates a real visual language of insanity throughout this book that the reader just has to ride along with and hope that they don't lose themselves along the way like Amadeus Arkham did. And so I can keep going, but I think I'm going to stop because, holy crap, I'm at 14 minutes. I'm sorry. This video wasn't supposed to be this long. Anyway, formally speaking, Amadeus Arkham Asylum is a book which really pushes the boundary of what is the medium of comics. Because this isn't just this isn't just a series or rows of panels. This is a real multimedia experience that feels at the same time like an acid trip, as well as a real descent into madness. Gosh, read this book, or if nothing else, you don't even have to really read it. Just look through the pages and watch the images. They will sink into you. And sometimes you may want to close the book and take a quick shower, because, oh God, that April Fool's, man, just, ugh, but God, it's so good. Check it out. Now, whew. Let's do the last hurrah and then call it a day. So, what is the journey? What is the birth? What is the rebirth? What is the challenge that we face as a reader when approaching Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth? The challenge is not geeking out. Holy crap, this book is amazing. It is an excellently constructed tome and an excellent example of what is possible through the medium of comics. And it's also a kick-ass read, man. Read this shit. When we're talking about Arkham Asylum, it is a book that some people don't believe has aged terribly well. I'm going to disagree to my last breath. I think it's still an amazing example of the medium of comics and what's possible through it. While it may not necessarily qualify as a traditional Batman book, that's one of the interesting appeals of the work for me. Instead of rigidly following the archetype, Grant Morrison invites the reader to challenge the archetype, to wonder if that archetype is strong enough to survive. And ultimately, he demonstrates that yes, once again, even at Batman's lowest moments, he is able to sort of reaffirm himself. And in true, it may be a matter of insanity. But even if it is, it's still somehow, in the face of all of that, an affirmation of his self and perhaps his destiny. The story, while at times can be extraordinarily heavy and ridden with truly atrocious imagery and details, can still be an amazing journey through a realm that, while it may seem terribly alien to most people on a day-to-day level, is unfortunately a reality for some people. Insanity insanity contains multitudes, and anybody, especially in this time of COVID-19, can understand and appreciate how important mental health can be and what isolation can do to one's mind. But one of the interesting things, again, about Arkham Asylum is it never becomes exploitative. This is not insanity to just sort of go, ooh, look how crazy people are. They're not crazy. They're people who are sick. And ultimately, the story is not about demonstrating or revealing insanity as sort of the ultimate source of corruption or as ultimately a sign of weakness, but it's ultimately really more a challenge. How can mental health ultimately impact our destiny as human beings? And then in terms of the form of comics, Arkham Asylum is a study unto itself. Every single page of this book is brilliantly constructed and gorgeously rendered, so that even the most minor characters assume a kind of profound significance to the reader, and you're left digging through panel after panel trying to find every last small esoteric detail. I can't say enough about this book. Clearly, the time we're at now, this is an amazing book, and I would love to keep talking about it, but your time is precious, so I'll just simply say this. If you haven't read this book, take the time to read it. If you want to make comics, take the time to read it. If you've never read it, give it a shot. It's really worth your time. And again, this book being as popular as it is, it stays in print, so it's pretty relatively easy to track down. And just, if somehow or another Grant Morrison and Dave McKean see this video, endless respect, y'all. Just, you kick ass. Thank you. Thank you for this book. All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you, the viewer. As always, you are nothing if not patient, or perhaps you're truly insane, but hey, you're in good company. When it comes to this book, it stays in print, and as you can see, I've got two different versions of it. This, I believe, is the first paperback edition of the book. Let's see. First printing trade paperback edition, printed in Canada. Yeah, so I think this is the first trade paperback of it. They usually do like a this is the 15th anniversary. I think they did like a 25th or 30th anniversary recently with artwork again by Dave McKean. So I guarantee you, your local comic book shop almost certainly has a copy of this. If they don't, they can go ahead and order it for you, because DC makes sure to keep this on their rack. In terms of local libraries, again, your local library, if they have a comic book section, probably does have it. If don't, suggest to them that they purchase it, or put it out through an interlibrary loan and they can get it to you. In terms of this video, like I said, I went ahead and wrote a review of it for my friend's blog entry on Comixosity for his ongoing series, The Comics Classroom. I'll post a link to the description below. And while you're there, check his writing out. His name is Michael Greenhill. He's amazing. He's also the co-host of the KMP podcast, which is available through iTunes, Spotify, what have you. Just check them out. They're hysterical. And finally, like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz, and thank you, truly. I really appreciate it. You guys are awesome, and I love you so much. Have a happy Halloween, and go read some comics.